All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth week of 6 acts and 6 sessions. Less snow out there, eh? Kind of nice. A little bit easier to move around, which we're grateful for. Well, thanks for coming out, whether this be your first week joining us or your fourth or somewhere in between. If we haven't met yet, my name is Maddie, and I'm part of the Act 5 staff team. And yeah, I'm just grateful to welcome you here and be part of this evening as we continue diving into the 6-act drama of Scripture and learn from some incredible dynamic teachers and scholars. If you don't know about Act 5, we are an educational Christian community that's rooted in Hamilton. We live 2 blocks from here, and we seek to engage and prepare young adults to be faithful improvisers in the world. And if you've been to our house, we have this really beautiful front porch where we spend lots of time, and it's become this symbol, this place where you kind of hang out and have some really fun conversations and really deep conversations, and you have silence and solitude, and you live mundane life. But it's this symbol of the kind of coming and going, of welcoming people into our home, but then leaving and going outside. And so as Act 5, as an organization, as we're growing up, we are stepping off of our front porch for conversations beyond just our gap year program and residency program, which if you want to learn more about those, you can go see myself or Lena at the back table. But tonight together, we are learning and leaning into this big story that unites us. We're coming together in pretty divided times, but with the hope that our imaginations can be stirred to remember where our common story begins, reimagine how to live with the hope of where God is leading us. So with that, tonight, I'm going to welcome up Steve MacDouell. Fun fact about Steve, we grew up at the same church together in London, worked there at one point together. Steve remembers me when I was in junior high. He's a few years older than me, but I was 14 years old, I think, when we were hanging out at youth. And fun fact too, this afternoon we were at the podcast studio where we record the Act 5 podcast. And so in a couple weeks, you will hear Steve on that. So if you want to learn more from Steve after tonight, subscribe to our podcast. Very shameless plug. All right, a little bit about Steve. When he's not pastoring at Free Church Toronto or teaching 20th century history at Fanshawe College, he's collaborating on place-based projects, writing about urban life, and inviting everyday citizens to leverage their time, their ideas, and their creativity for the sake of their neighborhoods. He's also the co-founder of Good City Co., a civic organization that creates projects, platforms, and activations to help citizens take greater ownership over their places that they call home. He lives, dreams, and conspires in Toronto's Little Portugal neighborhood. So tonight, as we move into Act 4, his talk is titled When God Moves into the Neighborhood. So as per usual, Steve is going to share. We'll take a little intermission after that and come back for some Q&A to kind of close out the night. So with that, let's welcome Steve.
I realized halfway through that introduction that I came up way too early. Just standing there like a weirdo. Well, if all of that is read. A few years back, I read a book, and maybe some of you have read it along the way too. It is a book called Sapiens. Has anyone read this book before or familiar with some of the ideas in it? Essentially, the book is about what is it in human capacity that makes us equipped to kind of dominate the world in the way that we have? What is it about humans that have made them so successful in terms of building empires and creating nations? What is it about humans? Is there something special about them? And throughout this book, which kind of takes a scope from very, very early hunter-gatherers up, not quite to the present moment, but quite far in terms of scope, the author argues that there are 2 things about humans that make them distinct. The first is that humans can cooperate flexibly and in large numbers. That this is something unique to human beings, that they can cooperate flexibly and in large numbers. They can do both of these things at the same time, whereas primates, for example, they can cooperate really flexibly. Right? So they're really intuitive emotionally. They can work really, really well in small collectives. But if you put 2,000 gorillas in a stadium, they couldn't work together, right? It would descend into chaos. and to violence, because they need to be in small, knowable groups to be able to work flexibly and creatively. On the flip side of that, there are species that can work in really, really large numbers. And those would include bees, for example. Bees are these really complex species, such a keystone species, right? If bees go away, essentially we go away. They hold the cosmos together in really practical ways. But bees can work in really, really large numbers, but they can't work flexibly, which means that you're not going to see a worker bee take over the queen, pronounce some kind of new ideology or way, and ultimately convince all the other worker bees to come on side. They can cooperate in really, really large numbers, but it's a rigid cooperation. They can't cooperate flexibly. So humans do both of those things. They cooperate flexibly and in very, very large numbers. So that's number one. But he argues that the reason that we can do that is because we're the only species who can create and believe in stories. He calls them fictions. When he says fictions, he's not saying that they're not true stories, but they live in abstract reality, which means that we can describe things that aren't in the material world. Things like states and nations, things like democracy, things like currency. Right? The only reason a $5 bill has any value is because we've told a story about the $5 bill and we've all agreed to the same story. Right? So that is what he means by living in an abstract reality. And the ability to do that and tell those stories means that we can cooperate flexibly and in large numbers. But that ability to live in this non-material world with these abstract ideas means that we have a long history of coming up with all kinds of thoughts about God, about what God might be like. And oftentimes, if you look through history, those ideas about God are often a reflection of us, our sensibilities and hopes and yearnings, maybe our present circumstances, sometimes our shortcomings, our instincts that we project onto God, that which we deem important about ourselves, tragic about ourselves, hopeful about ourselves. We're the only species who can come up with a concept like God. If you told a gorilla that in exchange for 2 bananas, that they could go to heaven when they die, they would never give you those bananas, ever, because they live in material existence, but we don't, which means that we can come up with all kinds of concepts about what God might be like. Sometimes it leads to flourishing, and sometimes it leads to ill. But then we encounter this text. And this text is found in John chapter 1, the beginning of the Gospels. This comes from Eugene Peterson's translation of the Message. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. The idea that the God who brings forth the whole cosmos out of God's own imagination and sense, that God takes on the material existence and moves into close and intimate and at times uncomfortable proximity with humans. This God, shrouded in mystery and unknowability, takes on a fleshiness that is touchable and observable. And so we, as Christians, start with this profound idea that in Jesus, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And Paul says, not only this, but the image of the invisible God is found in this one. So all of that speculation, all of that projection about who God might be and what God might be like, all of that now has to hedge on the fact that in Jesus we see what the eternal God is like. And that anything that doesn't line up with what we observe in Jesus is at best a misunderstanding. And at worst is probably a projection of our own experience, our own self. So what I want to do with our remaining time is play with this idea. What do we observe about this Jesus? If Jesus shows us who God is and what God is like, what can we observe about this Jesus who gives us this insight into who God has eternally been. Right? So I get the sense in this crowd that we can play with some ideas here. Right? We feel good with playing with some ideas. I want to throw out some ideas about what I observe in Jesus, and maybe you do too, what that tells us about God, but ultimately what it might tell us about our lives in the neighborhood, that we inhabit this good news of Jesus in really tangible ways. So the first thing I want to suggest is what we observe in this incarnate one is that Jesus embraces context in really profound ways. Jesus seems to believe that the good news is always contextual, that it speaks to our circumstances and complexities and experiences in real time. He tells stories that are riddled with local imagination, and that touches viewers, or listeners, I should say, because of it. He'll linger in his neighborhood for 30 years before we even hear anything about him, developing this localized vision for the world along the way. He speaks to the cultural and social and economic realities of his place, and he'll contend with the powers, and he'll comfort those who the powers have excluded and extracted from. That his gospel takes root in a particular place at a particular time where there is distinct needs and hopes and longings and opportunities. When I think about just how contextual the good news is, I think about Jesus' encounter with Bartimaeus. Maybe you remember that story. Bartimaeus is a blind person who calls out to Jesus while he's walking with his friends. And part of what I love about Jesus is that he doesn't assume what people want from him, but rather invites them to participate in their own healing. Now, when he notices that Bartimaeus approaches, what does he say to him? What do you want from me? The good news is always contextual. It's always rooted in a locality, in a circumstance, in a moment. Jesus does not seem to assume what good news looks like to Bartimaeus. Instead, he begs the question, appeals to his needs and longings, his hopes, his imaginations. People would not have cared about what Bartimaeus thought, what he wanted, because the ancient belief was this idea that if you had some kind of disability like blindness, that you or your family had done something in the cosmic sense to deserve the affliction, that they had somehow heaped the problem onto themselves. Why would Jesus ask Bartimaeus what he wants? He's not deserving of the question because he's earned his way into blindness. I wonder if, in a missiological sense, that we've taken the same approach to our communities along the way, that we've somehow internalized the idea that some communities have earned their way to poverty, to disinvestment, to isolation, that they couldn't possibly know their way out of it, and they don't even deserve the opportunity, never acknowledging the outside forces that shape our communities and places. And of course, we've dehumanized people along the way, assuming we know what they need, but never really asking what good news looks like to them and to their communities. We do this in all kinds of different ways, in systemic ways, but we also do it in really small, interpersonal ways. I mean, we've built really great organizations and projects. We've planted churches and ministries, all with the best of intentions, but never asking what our local communities actually want, what they're longing for, what their own healing and wholeness might look like, what gifts and assets they already possess that are going to help them solve those most pressing challenges. There is something powerful, something significant that happens when we allow people the dignity to share what they long for, what they want their neighborhood to look and feel like, what they need and what they want to share. Jesus asks Bartimaeus what he wants. He celebrates the sacredness of the person in front of him. He contends with that person in front of him. And we're invited to do the same thing with the people and the communities that we share proximity with. Jesus seems to want Bartimaeus to play this active, participatory role in his own restoration, his own healing, shaping the process. A few years back, I did my thesis, and my thesis was on a woman named Jane Jacobs. Has anyone heard of Jane Jacobs before? So Jane Jacobs was an urbanist who thought about what makes neighborhoods interesting, how we design places for the well-being of people, and how often top-down powers disrupt the really rich flourishing that already exists in places with the best of intentions, but the worst of ideas. And so I wrote a little bit about what Jane has to teach the local church about faithful presence in the neighborhood. And I pointed to a story that I actually found in a documentary about these two figures. This is Jane on the left, and that's Robert Moses on the right. And what this documentary was discussing was the relationship between these two people. So Jane is this grassroots activist. Robert Moses is the biggest urban planner, most powerful person in New York, right? Could contend with the mayor of New York in terms of power and influence at the time. He was making plans for whole neighborhoods. And he was doing this, interestingly, from the vantage point of a helicopter. So there's this profound moment in the documentary. He's coasting above Manhattan, drawing up plans with pens and papers about what should go on in neighborhoods below. And I was struck in this documentary by the next scene because it jumps from him in the helicopter over to Jane. And where's Jane? She's on the sidewalks. She's in the local parks. Her orientation is one of listening and curiosity about what good news looks like in the neighborhood already. We see on the outside looking in blight, but on the inside looking out, there's a deep interconnectedness, a relational ecosystem where skills and assets are already being utilized. And so I was struck by this poignant picture of making plans from a distance in a helicopter and making plans together with your neighbors on the front stoop, in the local park, bookstore, in the sidewalks that people walk on every day. That there's something about that image that speaks to the way of life that Jesus calls us into, that Jesus seems to be persistent on incarnation, the movement toward the other, and that there's something humanizing that happens in that exchange. When we open ourselves up to the other, we might just discover the gifts and assets, the longings, what good news looks like to our communities. We shift away from here's what we will do for you and become increasingly open to what can we do with you in your place. I love how Jane says it, and only the way she can. Cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they're created by everybody. This is the invitation that Jesus invites his listeners, those in proximity with him, to participate in their own healing, their own restoration, and we do the same. Now, I'm more and more realizing that part of the task of embracing context is recognizing our own limitations, accepting our partiality, and doing less but better. There is a word for it in German, as there often is. I forget what it is, but less but better. Less but better. In a human sense, and this is going to let some of us off the hook, I hope, we actually aren't equipped to fully process the traumas and challenges that are going on across our cities, nations, and the world as a whole. Because much of our formative history, go back to Harari, what we were talking about a few minutes ago, most of our formative history is in small, noble groups where we have no concept or idea of what's going on elsewhere. Our physiology, how we've actually been formed and shaped over time, is not equipped to know what we know, the information that we possess about what's going on all around the world. And so there will be moments in your week where you're exposed to information that you shouldn't have. Not in a technical sense, of course, you have access to that information, but in a physiological sense, you are not equipped to hold it or to process it. And so what this does over time is that it can really lead us to apathetic forms of inaction because we become overwhelmed with the information we possess because we're not actually equipped in a physiological sense to process it. And so figuring out what our contribution to the world is seems to be of the utmost importance. And I dare say, becoming hyperfixated on that thing will be also of the utmost importance. That because we don't have the capacity to process it all, we have to narrow our focus on the thing that is going to be our unique and distinct contribution, taking into account our gifts and skills and capacities. What is the thing we are going to lend our time and energy and our imagination to? This is part of moving into context. It's determining where our hands should work and should toil. I love the way that Wendell Berry says it. No matter how much one may love the world as a whole, one can live fully in it only by living responsibly in some small part of it. Where we live and who we live there with define the terms of our relationship to the world and to humanity. We thus come again to the paradox that one can become whole only by the responsible acceptance of one's partiality. That we move in, we adopt that kind of incarnational impulse that we see in Christ. We become attentive to what good news looks like to our neighbors, and we toil in that good work. And then ultimately we narrow our focus. That's why I'm so focused on the neighborhood, because I think it's the agent of change in our world. I think it's small enough that you can be a known character in it, but large enough that you can live a lot of life in it and a lot of things can happen in it. And so that invitation to discern and to listen to what good news looks like and to narrow your focus is an important one. The second thing I think maybe we can observe about Jesus is this extension of hospitality. It tells us something about God. It tells us something about our role in the world. Whether it's dining with tax collectors or conversing with those ethnically and religiously different than him, Jesus practices a very specific form of hospitality, one that crosses socioeconomic boundaries and one that requires this embodied proximity with the other. I've been engaging a lot with the work of Richard Beck. Has anyone heard of Richard Beck along the way? He was a literary historian who wrote a book called Unclean, Meditations on Purity, Hospitality, and Mortality. He talks about a whole bunch of different things in that book, but one of the things he becomes focused on is the human default toward disgust. So he talks a lot about disgust. And he talks about how disgust has a way of shaping our thinking, our actions, our imagination in the world. So he distinguishes between a couple forms of disgust. And this is going to move us toward hospitality. Okay, I promise. One is core disgust. So this is what you experience when you smell raw meat or something that has died. That visceral sense in yourself that I should get away from this, that comes from years and years of human formation where we know deep in ourselves, if you eat that, you might die or you're going to have a terrible experience. That is built into us, that kind of gut reaction to certain smells, including rotting flesh, like that of meat. That's a core disgust. It's an evolutionary mechanism against physiological harm. But then we have something called social moral disgust. And this is a secondary, I'll explain what's going on there in a second. This is a secondary, more symbolic mechanism that monitors an abstract space. So picture your spiritual space around you. Social moral disgust monitors our boundaries by attempting to locate potential interpersonal contaminants and preventing them from entering our minds, our physical space, and our more personal spheres of life, from our homes and families to our relational circles and churches. This is a little clip from Curb Your Enthusiasm. Does anyone watch Curb? This is Larry David. So this is Phil Rosenthal. He created Everyone Loves Raymond, and he has his great travel cooking show. This is an episode where Larry does not want anything to do with Phil Rosenthal. And he knows that if he puts on a MAGA hat and he does it in public, that Phil will not sit with him. He won't want to sit with him. And this is Larry's way of he would rather risk being ostracized publicly than actually have to deal with the person in front of him. And so this is what he does, but it's a great example of socio-moral disgust. The challenge with socio-moral disgust is that it feels very similar to core disgust. Physiologically in us, it feels very similar. It's visceral. It's immediate. It can be very jarring. And yet, to extend hospitality in the way of Jesus, we have to be able to temporarily suspend disgust, disdain, and discomfort long enough for love to become a possibility. You cannot permanently suspend disgust, but you can temporarily suspend it to be increasingly open to the other. And think about, for those of you who've changed a diaper before, anyone changed a diaper? I know some of us are in the throes of that, but some of us have changed a diaper. To change a diaper, you have to overcome the disgust inherent in a contaminating substance like baby poop. A person has a powerful aversion to that, aversions that have existed in us as a species for a really long time. But what happens when you change a diaper? You temporarily suspend disgust to truly extend love to that child. You have to be able to temporarily suspend that. You don't want to be around fecal matter for a long time, but you're willing to temporarily suspend it in order to extend love to that child. And over time, for those of you who have changed a lot of diapers, the practice of suspending disgust makes the act of changing a diaper easier over time, and that the love extended becomes more and deeper. You begin to notice the contaminant less and less. Now, for those of you like me who made the assumption I don't feel disgust toward anyone on a socio-moral level, I wonder if we could provoke our own thinking right now in terms of the people that exist in the world and the circumstances that exist in the world. So who would be the kind of person that if you were dining with them on a local patio, you'd be tainted or defiled in some way? Now, picture the kind of person that if someone saw you with them, if they knew their beliefs and values, their activities, and if they thought that you were actually friends with them, who would that person be? And what kinds of feelings of moral corruption would you be experiencing? If you belong to an in-group, people who align with your political, social, relational, and economic sensibilities, who are the people on the outside of that looking in? And how do you feel toward them? Who would be the kind of person that if you were asked to understand their viewpoint or consider how they may have come to the conclusions that they have come to, you'd feel a sense of alarm or compromise, fear, hatred, disruption? Of course, this is not to say that people don't have bad ideas that should be critiqued, or that through hospitality, we adopt a whole new set of values ourselves. That's not what I'm suggesting here. It's simply to say that disgust and the distance that it causes is a real phenomenon that we must account for if we're going to extend hospitality across difference. In some way, that disgust will have to be temporarily suspended, trusting that the Spirit is actually at work in the tension, wooing that person and yourself to God's self. I'm part of a group in Toronto, so maybe you've been tracking. Toronto assumes everyone's tracking with our news, and we're the center of the universe. But we have been having some real challenges when it comes to safe injection sites. So a lot of that's being clawed back by the province right now. So there's a contingent of 4 or 5 of us next week who are going to host an event, mostly for people of faith, around safe injection sites and answering some questions, debunking some myths around them, and why we feel like this is a good form of harm reduction. It is not the ideal, but this is a form of reducing the amount of harm that people experience. Now, to do that conversation well, we have to convince a whole group of people to temporarily suspend disgust, because we feel that. And you are not an immoral person for feeling that, okay? The challenge, I think, culturally in the moment we're in is that you should feel shame for feeling disgust toward a drug user. That's unhelpful in terms of solutions, feeling shame. What we need to do is compartmentalize that well, to say, I feel a visceral reaction to someone who uses intravenous drugs, right? There is a physical response to needles themselves, right? So take that as you will. That is a physiological response. I feel X, Y, and Z about why this person is using drugs. So there is some level of disgust around how someone might come to the position that they're in, addicted to opioids or some other form of substance. And so our task next week is to convince everyone in that room to, even for 30 minutes, suspend the disgust you feel. You're not wrong for feeling it. You're not evil for feeling it. Progressives, who are mostly who I'm hanging out with, they do not have a monopoly on morality. And maybe there's some leanings in themselves that are more open for whatever reason to the plight of someone in the throes of addiction, but they do not have the monopoly on morality. And we have to all be willing to dance a bit. And to dance, we have to suspend disgust and be okay with the fact that we feel it. And most of them, because I'm largely one of them, we feel it too, if we're being honest. We feel it too. We don't understand the complexity of the issues. It seems like we're empowering people to use more drugs by giving them clean needles in a safe place to do it, observed by medical professionals. But if we are willing to suspend disgust, even for a few minutes, and see what's actually going on in those places, how it is saving lives, how it is the best possible scenario in a very, very terrible scenario, and still engage with very real questions around the precariousness and the challenges of those sites, it's going to require all of us to dance. And to dance, we are going to have to suspend some level of disgust in order to create the potential for love to break forth. Jesus breaks the paradigm around hospitality to sit with a tax collector, someone who had oppressed and extracted from his friends and his family and his neighbors, who had this economic worldview of scarcity, who had co-opted power with the Roman state to extract from his own countrymen. This is a risky form of contaminating hospitality. But if Jesus didn't have to suspend disgust, he was surely aware of the disgust that everybody else who would have been observing those interactions would have had toward that situation. But Jesus seems to think that something happens. The Spirit is uniquely at work in the tensions of hospitality. That when we trust the Spirit in moments where we suspend disgust, that we might encounter what God's up to in the world. And Jesus seems to believe that. I'll close the hospitality piece on a great piece I read in the Washington Post a few years back. It was discussing the polarization that's going on in political discourse, predominantly in the U.S. This was before the last election, but it was talking about the history of polarization in the United States. Now, so there's a suspension of disgust, but then there's the second piece I said off the top, which is moving into proximity, that Jesus's form of hospitality suspends disgust, moves into proximity. So what was observed in this article was something that happened back in the 90s. So Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, maybe some of you are familiar with him, what he did was he changed the legislative calendar so that most work could get done midweek. The reason for the shift, and what they're suggesting Gingrich had in mind, was that he had noticed that politicians on both sides of the aisle were becoming less partisan and more collaborative because they lived in the same neighborhoods, they dined around the same tables, and they shared proximity in an ongoing basis. There was a sense of knownness and mutuality, which was cultivated over time. After the change that was made in the legislative calendar, though, that went out the window because people were now just flying in for a day at a time and flying back out to their jurisdictions. There's something about proximity that humanizes the other. It's not enough to just temporarily suspend disgust, but Jesus shows us that we have to move intimately and uncomfortably close, not in a way that excuses the harm that has been caused or that compromises our convictions about how the world should be, but in a way where we can see our own brokenness, our own shortcomings and frailties reflected back at us. Good fiction does this too, doesn't it? I am on a large fiction kick right now. Fiction is so important. When I'm talking to church leaders, I'm not telling them to read more nonfiction. I'm telling them to read more fiction, because fiction does this for us. It doesn't paint one-dimensional characters or caricatures. There's always more nuance and complexity to explore. No one is fully good or fully bad. The protagonist is fractured and susceptible to doing destructive things with good intentions. The antagonist causes harm and dysfunction, but we get glimpses at what has transpired in their life to lead them to the outcomes that they find. There's tension there, and it requires that kind of curiosity and time and tenacity to tease out. It requires presence with the other. Sometimes it's as if our art is telling us a different story than our politics and our communities. It tells us something about how fractured we are and how in need of wholeness and restoration we are. Proximity moves us toward critiquing injustice and subverting oppression without ever dehumanizing the offender. Jesus embodies this kind of hospitality that takes risks, that suspends disgust for the sake of love, that crosses socio-moral boundaries and invites us to do the same. I'll close with this. The last thing that I think is so observable in the way of Jesus is his love for enemy. Now, I will put my cards on the table and tell you I am an Anabaptist, and in my theology is peace and this commitment to peace and the way of Jesus being this one of nonviolent resistance. Now, if there is something clear in the cross, I'd like to suggest that it's that Jesus would rather suffer for his enemies than bear arms against them. That when Jesus calls us to love our enemies, he's not asking us to do anything that he was unwilling to do himself. And that the demonization of our enemies, according to Jesus, that the outflow of our dysfunction in the world actually starts in our hearts and in our imaginations. And then it flows from there. I'll close with this confession. I am growing more and more skeptical that we have free will. Now, let me back that up for a second. I think, not in some kind of divine sense, as if God's orchestrating it all, but actually in a neurochemistry sense. So I've been getting really into neurochemistry lately. I'm not a scientific mind. I don't claim to know much about neurochemistry, but I'm reading a lot about how the brain functions. And there's some really interesting research around when we make a decision, what's going on in our brain, that there are things being triggered in our brain before we make decisions that would indicate there are things at play that are beyond our general sense of human will. Now, if it's true that, listen, I'm still on the free will train, but I think it's very tampered with. And I think it's very influenced by things, most of which are out of our control. And these folks would suggest that there is so many different things that shape our decisions in the world, right? There is our genetics. There is trauma. There is past experiences. There are the conversations that we've accidentally stumbled into. There is your parents and how they formed you and raised you. There's the food that you eat. There is where you were born. There are all these hosts of factors that shape how we make decisions in the world without us ever even really recognizing it. That if we were in somewhere else with different food and different genetics, different predispositions, that our actions in the world would look radically different. Now, we like to think that our will is uninhibited, that we can make all the decisions we want to make, and that anyone who makes a bad decision, including our enemies, are doing it intentionally because they have full control of their will. One thing that is helping me love my enemies, and I admit they're pretty few. I mean, many of us are living in a lot of privilege where my enemies are few, and even those I would maybe even place in that category, the real risk or threat to me in any kind of measurable, serious way is pretty low. But what I would say, as I feel that kind of socio-moral disgust towards some, and maybe you do too, there is a confluence of factors that make us who we are. And I'm not discouraged by the idea that our free will is tampered with. I think it's pretty evident in the research and in my own experience of the world, and maybe your experience of the world too. But what it helps me do is it helps me humanize those I deem as other. It could lead us to some kind of nihilism. And then it doesn't matter what we do. If our actions are dictated, it doesn't matter. I'm saying we still have some semblance of it, but it's pretty tainted, which means that we can have a lot of grace for our enemies. We can have a lot of grace for people who land in different ideological positions than us, because there are factors, many of which are out of their control, that lead them to be who they are. And so I don't think it has to lead us to nihilism. I think it really actually creates the opportunity to lead us to some form of humanization, where we start to take into account that people are a confluence of factors, many of which are out of their control. That would change the systems we make. I know someone who would believe that we have no free will at all based on neuroscience. And he would say that's why our prison system should be reformed, is because we place all the blame for wrongdoing on prisoners as if they had a million other choices to make. But when you actually look at the factors that shape us into decision-making people, most of that autonomy is taken from us in some way. We don't like to accept that, but there are too many confluence of factors that shape who we are, and that can make us more gracious. To be like Jesus, to love our enemies, means suspending disgust. It means incarnationally moving close. And it probably means doing the math, the creative, imaginative work to imagine what someone must have experienced, or the factors that have shaped them into who they are, that have brought them to the conclusions that they've come to. That doesn't mean we agree ideologically. It doesn't mean that we come on side. It means that we still contend with the powers, but at the same time, we never get to the point of dehumanizing our enemies. Because not only are they image bearers, but they are shaped by forces far outside of themselves. I think that's where we'll pause. I'm not entirely sure what comes next. Intermission. Let's do the intermission. We need a breather, hey? Is that okay, Maddie? Go in peace for some coffee, and we'll call you back in like...
All right. We can come back together. So one of the reasons why we love having spaces to gather, why we do it around tables, is we don't just want to be people who consume more content. We can get that everywhere. But we want to be a community of learners and wrestle together in spaces where you might interact with someone around your table you've never met before. And now you've had a conversation and have wrestled through something. And that's really beautiful. So I hope you've had some good conversation and maybe know a new name at this point. So we're going to mosey on into a Q&A. And I didn't bring my running shoes, but that's okay. I'm going to run around with the microphone. If you have a question, be forewarned that Steve might throw a question back at you and make it a bit conversational, and that'll be fun. So anyone feeling brave and eager and have the first question of the night? Nice.
Okay, I'll try to express this well and clearly. I think like the person of Jesus invites us into a lot of different things. And I'm wondering about, like what's the balance between the invitation to see Jesus as sort of the way for us to help other people we see around us as those who need to be helped, and we're the helpers. Whereas, what's the balance between that and we are those who need to be helped by Jesus? And is there, it seems like people tend to like overemphasize one or the other. And is there like a way to marry those two?
Yeah. No, It's a good question. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, I'm in this kind of phase of life where I have a lot of kind of intellectual frameworks for faith, but in my heart I don't feel it that much, if I'm being honest. Like I'm in this season where I'm longing for reenchantment. And part of that I think is the recognition of just how deeply I need the experience of God in my life, and how for so long I needed new frameworks to think about God's activity in the world. I needed new ways of thinking about what it means to follow Jesus. But then me and a bunch of my friends around my same age, I think, are in this season of life where we're realizing that the justice way of Jesus, a lot of what we talked about tonight, this kind of praxis in the world, um, is insufficient until there's some kind of animation of the heart, and until there's some kind of transformative work of the Spirit in our lives, some kind of re-enchanting where the world comes alive again, and where I recognize the depths of my fracturedness, but also the abundance of God's love to transform my heart, to warm my heart, to moisturize the calluses on my heart. And so you're right to say, and I'm in a context where there's a heavy emphasis on the way of Jesus. And that leads us into the neighborhood, and it leads us to do and to make and to think in these ways. But you're also pointing out something really important. There is this reorientation around the way of Jesus, which I think we talked about tonight. But there is also this re-enchantment that needs to happen, where we encounter the good news in a way that transforms our hearts, our very selves. And so, point taken, I'm longing for re-enchantment again, that the gospel would do something in my heart, in my very self, that makes me feel again. Because I got to be honest with you, like intellectually, I'm still saying the creeds, but on a heart level, the magic has left the building a little bit for me. And so something that's helping me with that is part of this community called Free Church in downtown Toronto. And there are people who have all of these different stories. I sat down with a guy 2 weeks ago who was an ardent atheist. He took mushrooms, became agnostic, and then looked up churches, found Free Church down the street, embraces Jesus as Lord, is taking the Eucharist, is being formed in this community. So that all of a sudden my heart, picture the Grinch at the end of when the Grinch stole Christmas, right? His heart grows by a few sizes. And so I'm being re-enchanted by the stories of others who are being transformed by the good news in ways that are radical. Listen, we are not a charismatic community in terms of how we understand the Spirit at work amongst us. There is a woman in our community who I just had coffee with her the other day. She is an MIT grad, works as an engineer in medical technology. The other day, had a charismatic experience where she more or less threw up a demon, and had kind of this radical deliverance from physical healing and trauma, emotional healing and trauma, spiritual healing and trauma. And it was a before and after moment for her. So here's how I'm sitting at that coffee table. I believe it intellectually. I mean, I struggle to believe some of what I'm hearing, but intellectually, I'm still on board with the Christian story being the most jarring, disruptive, good story that makes the most sense of the world and our existence in it. And at the same time, I'm also feeling the magic a little bit again. Like, I don't know exactly what to do with that story of this woman. If I didn't know who she was, I would be more skeptical, but I know who she is. And she's having some kind of radical encounter where she's trying to explain it away herself. She doesn't fully comprehend what's going on. I'm being re-enchanted to what's going on in the spiritual world, and how the gospel is good news in that as well. And that those worlds are just like the ancients believed, right? The spiritual world and the material world, the border between those is razor thin and blurry. And I'm I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but I think on a heart level, on a gospel level, on a need for God's love and mercy to transform my own heart, not just for works of justice or moving into the neighborhood, but to help me realize the deepest levels of my own dysfunction and frailty and the harm I've caused in the world, as well as God's abundant grace and provision and welcome and kindness and generosity in an experiential way.
So good. The residents at Act 5 are currently invited to read a book called Recapturing the Wonder by Mike Cosper, if you've heard of it, if anyone's heard of it. And it talks a lot about this idea of reenchantment and where have we lost it along the way. So if you want another recommendation.
Hey, Steve. Just because you mentioned reenchantment as kind of a theme in this and the intellectual side, I'm curious, you talked about understanding that people aren't making just free will decisions every day all the time. And so when people make decisions, understanding that they're not always choosing to do something can grow our empathy or our ability to connect with them. I'm curious if you would make any connections between, you mentioned the spiritual realm, spirits, angels, demons, whether experientially or just more intellectually, what connections do you see between spirits, the powers, the principalities, and free will, and maybe even like city planning? Like you talked about going up in the helicopter and having a high place view, from above to below versus a bottom up kind of perspective. I just feel like there's a lot of spiritual undertones and patterns in what you're talking about, and I'm curious if you've made any connections, whether intellectually or just experientially.
Yeah. Well, the academic part of me likes measurable things, right? So as soon as we enter conversations around what's going on in the spiritual realm and how that influences what goes on in our daily rhythms, it feels speculative. And so I have some thoughts, but it feels speculative. Where free will and human agency begins and spiritual influence and formation begins, I'm not entirely sure how that kind of works out in the world. I think if you remove the spiritual, which we can't, but if you remove it, there are so many factors that shape how humans function in the world. I'll give you an example, but then I'll get to the question of the spiritual. So I talked about substance use in my talk. And one of the things I tell my students, so I teach a course on the history of drugs. And so we talk all about how drugs have moved around the world and the policies and the ways that we've addressed addiction in the past. So one of the things that I pointed them to is an experiment. And it was actually an experiment done in Vancouver's East Side years and years ago. It was an experiment that dictated a lot of drug policy that would follow. The experiment was, if you put a rat in a cage and you give it water and you give it a drug-infused water, that it will choose the drug-infused water to the point of overdose, right? That is what it will do. And you can measure that by any rat that's put in that cage, it will do that. The second experiment that's done, though, years later, Dr. Bruce Alexander was his name, and keeping in mind that the idea of that first experiment was, if you try drugs once, this means that you will be addicted forever and it will lead to overdose. The chemical hooks in drugs are so significant that it will lead to overdose. And you keep coming back to them. The second experiment happens, and instead of a rat being alone in the cage, the rat is joined by other rats, and the cage is bigger. And there's water and drugs, but there's also nutritious food. There's a wheel to run on. There are activities for the rats. It can bond with others. It can have little rat babies. And interestingly, the rats will still drink both the drug-infused water on occasion and the regular water, but none of them overdose. And so the takeaway from the research, and this would go on to impact how we see policies now, some see them this way anyway, that it's not sufficient to say that people who use drugs because of the chemical hooks in the drugs, right? That is not a sufficient explanation for what's going on with addiction. Rather, the cage that you live in your access to bonding, your access to meaningful work, the traumas and experiences that you have, some of the genetic dispositions and leanings you might possess, that all of this forms one's experience in the world. And our policies have typically been about punishment. So if you use drugs, it's because you don't have the kind of will needed to not use drugs. So we'll punish you, we'll put you away, we'll separate you out from the bonds that you currently have, and we will penalize you for the drug use. But if it's true that our environments are really significant in shaping how we act in the world, then our policies around how we deal with addiction should probably reflect the nuances of addiction, which means a more holistic understanding of how the environment influences people. So I don't think you need to jump to the spiritual to recognize just how potent our environment is. But when you add the spiritual into that, and again, I grew up charismatic. This was the border between the spiritual and the physical was even more razor thin than it probably ought to be in terms of how it played out in the real world. And so I'm coming out of that, but the pendulum swung too far for me. And now I'm starting to become open again to what the Spirit's doing in the world. And I do think that if there's proof for anything, there is proof that there is just evil in the world that seems to go and transcend beyond human decision-making. And I feel it, and I sense it. I think it's measurable in a lot of ways. And so the role that has, I think our primary responsibility as Christians is to deal with the material realities of people and ourselves, and then I'm increasingly open to pray against the demonic and the powers and principalities that would seek to dehumanize people and our experience of the world. I don't know where that all kind of shakes out, but and similar to your question, my last 15 years of faith have been thinking about the intellectual aspects of faith and the justice orientation toward the neighborhood. And it's only within the last year I've become increasingly open to how significant the spiritual really is in my experience of the world, my experience of Christ. And so I'm in process of being re-enchanted to that, which means that I have to take seriously stories like the one I heard this past week, where there is something going on there that cannot be explained in material terms. And we have to reckon with that.
Yeah, I have a question in regards to the Wendell Berry quote, or just kind of floated at that. This idea of like understanding your wholeness when you see your partiality and like knowing that you can't be everything for everyone. I'm just wondering your thoughts on how we like determine what that looks like for us personally, because I think that for each person it'll look different on like how partial we are, I guess. Do you have any thoughts on how we like understand those boundaries of, and when we know if we need to stretch ourselves, and when we know that we need to kind of pull back a bit?
Yeah. Well, I think figuring out what you love, figuring out what you're good at, what you're equipped for, what you have the skills and capacities to do, and then narrowing your scope in terms of, my bias is towards narrowing it around geography. And the reason for that, and the reason why I'm all in on the neighborhood idea, is because we can't choose who exists in the neighborhood with us in ways that we can curate other environments. So I think that puts us in a unique position of difference and tension and opportunity, and kind of the generative possibilities of that are pretty significant. So I think what I would say is narrow your scope, less but better, whether that's around geography, whether that's around a field, like a vocational field, whether that's around a particular idea or mission, and not to the exclusion of other things. But I don't know how old you are, but in your 20s especially, Figure out what you love, what you're good at, and be around people who are a little bit ahead of you, and be as close to proximity with them as you can, and glean things along the way. What would you say when you think about your own partiality? How do you kind of lean into that partiality, accept it, and figure out what it means to live a vibrant, faithful life?
I did warn you.
Yeah, I think that's something that I'm kind of working through right now. I'm about to graduate, and I'm an honors social work major, and so talking about addiction, that's something that I'm really interested in. And so I think that in a place like Hamilton, where you see so much brokenness and so many different social issues, like the opioid crisis and housing crisis, and it can feel hard to know where my place is in that, and this, like, where I can best use my gifts. And sometimes it can kind of feel like overwhelming, where it's like there's a lot of different places I could step into, but it's like, how do I was at school today and I saw like a booth for something set up, like another social, and I was like, I don't even think I have the capacity to like care about that. And if I felt bad, because I was like, this is a problem in the world, and I can recognize it as bad, but I like thought about it, and I was like, I do not want to think about that. Like I can't, because I just came out of a class where we talked about a whole bunch of other things. And so I think it's something that I'm working through and trying to like determine what skills I have. But I think it is hard to like feel like I can just like pick one thing and trust that is where I'm meant to be. But I think it's a process. So,
well, if you're just graduating, try a bunch of stuff. I mean, this is the time for exploration. No one's going to hold you to it. And don't feel immoral for not caring about everything. You can't. It is not a question of morality. It's a question of human capacity. There is nothing in your physiology that has equipped you to care for everything in the world or to know everything about what's going on in the world. So you're battling against years and years of human formation, right? Think about small groups of hunter-gatherers. That is what you're most equipped for. That is what humans were for the longest time. And so that is what you're best suited for. And you don't live in that environment. You live in a big city where people have come from all around the world to be here, who have all kinds of different longings and hopes and aspirations. And not only that, but you can know what's going on in countries on the other side of the world. There is nothing in your physiology that is equipped to do that. So figure out what you love, experiment, try some things. Everyone wants you to figure out what your contribution is. So reach wide and try some stuff, see what sticks. And then I really think, not that it's all about age, but I think your 30s is where you start to hone skills and capacities in a way that we tend to overestimate our immediate impact and underestimate impact over the span of time, like the compound interest of what we do. And so don't worry too much. Narrow your scope. Be easy on yourself. You're not an immoral person because you don't care about that issue. There's a good chance I don't know the issue. There's a good chance I don't care about it. And that's okay, right? We can have decency, right? We want people to thrive. But if your unique skills and contributions are in a particular field, the world would be at a disservice if your attention was being paid to 20 other things, right? So figure out what your contribution is, what you love, and do it with a lot of grace and tenacity.
that's helpful. Thank you.
Steve and I talked about this a little bit on the podcast we recorded today, and he used the word play and how there's permission to play and have some fun and be less rigid in what everything is.
I had a bit of a response to that, Joel. That quote made me think of something I'd heard once. I was at a conference and someone asked a very similar question: how do I know what I'm supposed to do? And the person who was speaking very simply said, do what you think everyone else should be doing. And I can say to you, Joel, what I think you should do with your life. But that has more to do with what I'm supposed to do with my life than anything it has to do with you. Find that thing that you feel like everyone should care about.
That's really good advice. I think the flip side of it would be to say, what is the thing you're most critical about in the world? What is the thing that you feel is the most absent in our world? or in our churches. I often hear this because I work in churches. People are critical about something about our local church, and it's often the thing that they're actually uniquely equipped to step into. And so sometimes our critique is a good indication of where our heart is. Now, if we just stay in critique and never get to making things, and this can be another challenge and issue, but that's really sound advice for our friend here.
Awesome. Other questions or comments?
I'm formulating the question portion of this, but one thing you said earlier, which is kind of unrelated to a lot of things, was about that Jesus waited 30 years for us to hear from him. And I was thinking, as I'm reflecting right now early on in Luke's gospel, right? Like you have Anna and Simeon and Zechariah, like all these people who experienced Jesus, and then like that anticipation time they had. Then they had that 30 years before, like we know something's coming. The Spirit's told us something's coming, and we wait and we wait and we wait. And then even when it does come, it's not quite what they expected, right? So from your experience, I think what my question is kind of long-term building relationships in communities, sitting in neighborhoods, learning what people, walking with them. And we look in political responses to a lot of the work that sounds like you've been involved in, where policies have been set and worked on and developed over years and years and years, and all of a sudden governments now are coming in and like in 2 days flipping things. And that's happening in the States, it's happened in the Ontario government, all these policies that have been built up over time just change quickly. So how does that affect your work, or how do you suggest it affects our work as we kind of try and build these long-term relationships, but the opposing forces seem to be moving faster and faster?
Yeah, that is the reality of things. I mean, part of it, I think you answered already, which is, can we stay long enough to outlive some of those bad decisions that are made in terms of political decision making, right? Are we going to be there beyond that and pick up some of the pieces of those policy failures? It's a good question. I mean, there's so often, I don't know about you and your experience in your neighborhood, but there seems to be a real disconnect from municipal, provincial, federal people who represent us at that level, and what's kind of going on the ground level. And I hope your experience has been different than mine, but it does seem like there is a distance there. And so bad decisions are being made. I mean, what I've observed in neighborhoods is people who have spent a lot of time in that place can often be the whisper in the ear of the MP or the MPP, right? They need people of peace. At least that's what we used to call them, like people who know everyone in the neighborhood, who have their pulse on what's really going on, the thing behind the thing, and that our MPs and our municipal leaders need those people to whisper those things to them. And so sometimes I'm seeing a lot of political leaders kind of an island on themselves. And then sometimes they're deeply integrated with a network of leaders who are going to help them make better policy decisions. So I'm very pro. So we've got a local city councilor in our faith community. And so we're always cautious about being too critical of our city. But at the same time, he wants to hear the collective wisdom of people who inhabit our city. And he has that posture of listening and eagerness. But you're right. I mean, bad top-down decisions are being made. Top-down decisions in general, made at a distance. A lot of these folks who are leading in our neighborhoods don't live in our neighborhoods, right? If you're an MP or an MPP, when you actually track down where they're spending most of their time, it's often not in the locality that they're serving. And so anything that puts pressure on hearing what's going on locally from folks who are actually inhabiting it, like some of us are trying to do, is warranted. I don't have a great answer to that. I mean, what do you think in terms of what are you observing is either subverting some of these bad decisions or addressing the collateral damage of them?
Don't know if I have a good answer to that, but I think what I observed and what I heard from you early on, what sparked in me is the idea that, like Jesus, we look post-resurrection, we look resurrection, like time goes on. The ministry doesn't end with the death. It keeps going on. And I think that's our hope. That's our positive aspect, is that we stick around longer than those decisions, that we maintain those relationships even after the decisions have been made, so that we can affect the future and affect ongoing. So I think that's That's where we're Christ, and I think is my answer, is that we get to stick around.
It's good. Yeah. That fidelity to place. And for those impacted by bad policy decisions, the fact that you're expressing a fidelity to that place, that you're going to see it through. I mean, the Spirit's been at work in our neighborhoods long before we got there, and will be at work long after we're gone. And we're invited to kind of tend to it while we're there. And so even within bad policy decisions, the Spirit is still percolating and doing very interesting things when we're attentive enough to notice. And so I feel like in those moments where it seems insurmountable, I'm just reminded that little things, the small acts of neighborliness, they really do have a compounding effect over time. And so when big policy decisions aren't going our way, I think focusing on what is in our control and trusting that the Spirit animates small things like mustard seeds in ways that go and transcend beyond our own efforts. My friend Tim Sorens calls it the compound interest of neighborhood presence. The idea that the things that we do, the small things that we do with the skills we possess and the longings we have, it not only lasts into the future of the neighborhood, but it lasts into God's future. That God longs to renew and restore all things, and the good that's done in the present, the Spirit can somehow carry it into the future. And so none of it's in vain, even if we don't get to see all of the ripple effects of it. And maybe that's just a coping mechanism for when things are really bad. But I do believe that, and I have seen that compounding interest in the lives of my neighbors.
I want to go in a little bit of a different direction and think about this drama of Scripture. This is something that I was introduced to here at Act 5, that never really heard of dividing the Bible up into this kind of creation, tragedy, Israel, Jesus, the church, new creation kind of understanding of Scripture. And so it's held my attention. But in my daily life, I encounter so many people who believe in God. I don't encounter that many atheists. People believe in something. But Jesus is really tricky. It's a stumbling block for so many people. And I'm curious, what is it about this plot twist of Jesus? Like, people can get behind creation and they see sin in the world and all that stuff. Do you know what I mean? And then we get to Jesus, and I really appreciated how you kind of divided things up, like context, hospitality, loving enemies. People can get behind those concepts. Like, yeah, I can show hospitality. I can be like Jesus. I can be like Jesus, but I can't believe in Jesus. So what is it about the plot twist of Jesus that makes you still want to tell the story of Jesus, and not so much in the sense of like, be like Jesus, but like, this is the real deal. This is the plot twist of the whole thing.
I wonder if you're finding this. I mean, it sounds like you're still feeling resistance to Jesus and the Christian claims about Jesus. I'm finding more and more the neighbors that I'm talking to are not. They are like post Christendom in the sense of they don't have any baggage with the kind of organized forms of religion and faith. There is kind of a generosity and an openness. It's more probably polytheistic in nature, in the sense of like, maybe there is some divinity to Jesus, but like, there's divinity to lots of things, and the particularity of Jesus sometimes gets missed. I do sense that. But for me, I mean, I still think this idea that God embraces this particularity that we talked about, and not only that, but overcomes death and decay, and this idea that deep in our hearts, when we know that things aren't well and the dysfunction seems to be winning out, there is this sense that that I haven't found in any other story or any other framework, that God can carry the good we do in the moment into the future in such a way that the whole cosmos are renewed and restored. I mean, I grew up in a framework where it was about going somewhere else when you die. And to be honest, that didn't enchant me, and I don't think it enchants our neighbors. But the idea that the people you love, the city you love, the things that you put your hands in, what if God has a good future in store for all of these things, and God's longing is not to do away, but to renew and restore and infuse the whole cosmos with God's Spirit. And that when you're in those moments of friendship where you feel like you're being seen and known, when you're creating and expressing yourself, you're getting these little tastes of what it's like when the presence of God descends on a people and a place. I still think the Christian story deals with the dysfunction of the world that seems apparent, right? When you talk about evil and sin, people know that that exists, right? It's verifiable, it's measurable, but also deals with this part of us that feels like, but maybe it doesn't have the last word. Maybe better futures are possible, not because we can bring them about, because we've shown time and time again that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, it's cyclical. There are things about it that show that we are just not very good at bringing the human story to a good conclusion. And so I think the farther we get into tragedy and the farther we get into environmental decay, the farther we get into the kind of the far reaches of what humans can do to make things better, there will be a breaking point where we have to trust that God, if God exists, which we claim is the case, is the only one who can kind of make this story come to a good conclusion, which is actually a new beginning of sorts. And I think when I talk to my environmentalist friends, they love that they don't have the baggage of knowing that we used to think that when you die, you go somewhere far away and God kind of does away with the earth. They don't have that baggage that I did. They are hearing in the Christian story that God wants to infuse all of creation with the very presence and spirit of God in such a way that it renews and restores the cosmos, from art and architecture to economics and social relationships. This expansive view of the kingdom that doesn't necessarily get you to the particularity of Jesus as Savior, but I'm finding an enchantment in my neighbors around just the notion that maybe there is a God. There is certainly a spiritual realm. They seem to be very in tune with that. But the distinctiveness of Jesus, I think, is sometimes lost because so much of Western culture has been shaped by the way of Jesus in ways that we don't even really pick up on anymore. Like the justice and mercy and some of the distinctives of Jesus is so baked into our cultural framework that it doesn't feel novel. But it sure felt novel in Rome, and it sure felt novel in the early church because it was so different and alien to the way the world was. How we re-enchant that story now, justice and mercy isn't going to do it because people who have lived in Western civilizations already hold those as fairly core values, or a lot of them do, and don't need Jesus to do that. Even if Jesus was the kind of the one who inspired people to shape those civilizations in the way they did. So how we re-enchant the story, I mean, I'm not entirely sure. I do sense some of the pushback of like, why does it have to be only Jesus? Like, why can't we kind of co-opt Jesus in the ways that we see fit? I see a lot of openness to that, lots of openness to spirituality, as you said. But I still think Jesus solves the problem of where human history is moving toward better than the other stories that I've encountered.
So we have time for maybe one more question if there's one. Well, then that's a great note to end on. Thank you for joining us tonight here at Benediction Church. Thank you all for coming out and being here. Hopefully your imagination has been sparked and things are swirling in you that you can take with you out these doors. We encourage you to continue having conversations with each other throughout the week. So next week, we're actually hopping an act. So we've done Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. Next week is Act 6. We're skipping over Act 5. Plot twist. If Act 5 is the story of now, the story of the church, We're going to end the whole series with the question of how then shall we live? But we need to know the first 4 acts before and then the 6th act, which is after, to then shape what that looks like. So next week, Laura DeYoung is going to be here talking about Act 6 before we go back to Act 5. So with that, we're going to close out the evening. Again, thanks for coming. If you want any information about Act 5 related things, feel free to chat with Lena or I at the back. Otherwise, we hope to see you next week.
Can I say just one last thing?
Sure.
Sorry. Because I feel like it would be fraught to not say it in response to what you said. The thing for me, I think, is the idea that God suffers. That is the thing that brings me back to the Christian story in a way that other stories don't. Yes, that God renews and restores the cosmos, but where I start with my neighbors is the idea that God suffers. So that's something unique about the Christian story, that this God opens God's self up to vulnerability and pain, which means that when my Catholic friends are holding on to the crucifix, which I never understood as a young evangelical, thought, why the fixation on death when Jesus is resurrected from the dead? It means that God, in my moment of suffering and pain, knows what it's like. That is a unique claim about the Christian faith, that this God could exist at a safe distance from our plight. But the incarnation tells us that this God moves in, suffers exclusion and ridicule and pain, which means that when I'm in pain, when I'm excluded, when I'm hungry, when I'm in the most desperate of circumstances, this God not only knows what it's like, but is uniquely close and present. And that, to me, is very good. It's very good news. I mean, it doesn't explain away evil in the world, right? It's not a sufficient answer for why God allows evil in the world, but it's not because God doesn't know what it's like. And I think that doesn't just let God off the hook as if God needs to be let off the hook, but it does tell us something about the nature of this God. And so that is often when I'm talking about spirituality with my friends and what's distinctive about the Christian story. It's incarnation, but it's also divine suffering. And that God can be trusted because this God knows what it's like, not distant like the gods of old, but this God's integrated and knows our pain and suffering. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it's not because God doesn't care, and it's not because God doesn't know what it's like. So that's part of the Christian story that still moves me and keeps me in the fold.
It feels like a beautiful benediction that God is with us in our suffering. Go in peace.